notes, kind of like some notes, sort of like I normally put out. There's also one sheet, right? For reference that I will go over in a minute. It's it has two columns on it. And I'm going to explain what that is in a minute. I'm not going to go really over it today, but I wanted to have it on the table just so you could look at it and kind of be familiar with it. And I'll talk about why it's important in just a minute. So in the series that we're in, yes.
Prayer sheet,
Yes.
heading toward John.
Heading towards John.
Yeah, it's on its way, but it's toward John.
On its way. All right, thank you.
Thank you, sorry.
No, that's okay. That's good. We're good. So in our series on reading the Bible after the Holocaust, the point of this is to have a lens through which we are looking at some stories in Genesis. And when we, it's just like when you put on reading glasses, or when you put on your sunglasses, or when you put on special kinds of glasses, 3D glasses, right? Anytime you put different glasses on, it causes you to see the world in a different way. And so while this class is not a class on the Holocaust, when we think about the Holocaust as sort of a stand-in for a number of humanitarian disasters, right, that have gone on in the world and that continue to go on even as we sit in this class. What this lens, I think, helps us to do is to think about how the Bible responds to, how does it speak to humanitarian disasters and difficulty, right? What does it cause us to think about? And how might that, and particularly with stories in Genesis that are so rich and so full of potential. The stories in Genesis, I think, are, because they are origin stories, they speak to universal themes. And so I think Genesis is a great pool to draw from as we go through this study. So for this series of classes, the first one we looked at isolation and belonging. Last week we looked at responsibility. What's our responsibility to other people? And today we're going to look at survival, right? What are the issues of survival? And really one of the way this relates, I think, to all of us is a lot of us make it through really difficult situations, right? But we have already. We've lived long enough. We've been through hard stuff. We've often talked in terms of, well, that was really hard, but, I survived it. I made it through. And, the question is, are we surviving well? You can survive, but do you survive well, or do you survive not so well? And if we survive well, that's good. But if we survive changed or maybe not so well, then a big question is, how do we support each other, right? And so the story today that we're going to look at particularly the issue of survival, and those, for example, those who did survive the Holocaust have a lot to talk to us about survival. There are a lot of people living in this immediate area who probably not who are Holocaust survivors, or they are children of Holocaust survivors. And I've had a number of conversations with the second generation Holocaust survivors. And one of the things that they almost universally share is this conflict between, do we talk about it or do we not talk about it? Right. So I have a friend who lives in Chicago. He is the son of two his mother and father were both survivors of the Holocaust from different countries. They actually met in a transition camp after the war. It was an American transition camp, and they were being, treated for trauma in different things. And that's how they met and eventually came to the United States to create and raise their family. And as he tells the story, his father didn't want to talk about it at all. Right. And both of them were Jewish, right? So his father wanted nothing to do. We don't want to talk about it. We don't mention it. It's in the past. It's over. We don't talk about it. His mother was quite the opposite. No, we should talk about it, right? We should let you know what we went through and all of this. And anyway, this was a big conflict in his family, so much so that when he was 18 years old, he realized he didn't even know who his family was. And so he moved to Israel for the sole purpose of trying to find his aunts and uncles and cousins. So, like, what happened to my family, right? And this story in different ways gets repeated over and over again. And the way it relates to our study of the Bible is that when we look through the stories of the Old Testament, these are origin stories that talk about families. They talk about where families come from. They make the stories of people visible. And I think that's one thing sometimes we miss about the power of these stories is that they're not just historical stories from which we can draw doctrine, right? I mean, that's really not what's happening. What's happening in these stories is that you're getting a sense of how Israel is telling its story, both the good and the bad, both the goodness of God, the promises of God, the direction of God, all of that is there too. But there's also, man, being the people of God it's rough. It's not easy. And I kudos again to Cynthia for in her sermons on Genesis, she has made that visible for us, right? The story of Jacob, right? Had this encounter with God, but was wounded in the process, the limb, right? And so that tends to come up in stories about people, moving with God. It's both easy and it's difficult. It's not easy. It's difficult. It's also blessed. It's also difficult. And so one of the things that comes up, and hopefully we'll talk about it in a later story, is that we use today in our religious cultural language, we use the term blessed a lot. Have a blessed day, right? Or be blessed, or we're blessed. I mean, it's really common, and we kind of know what we mean by that. But when you look at that term in the Hebrew Bible and you look at how and where it's used, blessings are not always all that great, right? I mean, you look at the blessing on Ishmael, for example, or the blessing on Jacob's sons, right? Some of it is good, and some of it's like, well, your blessing is you're going to be at odds with your brothers the whole time, right? Well, how's that a blessing? Well, blessing has to do with continuance, right? How you're going to continue, how you're going to move on, that's more the Hebrew Bible sense of it. So a lot of times our own language kind of gets in the way a little bit. And part of what this series, I hope, will do is kind of bring the language of the Old Testament into focus a little bit, because we'll get more out of it, right? If we can kind of touch base with how these scriptures are working. And so today, when we look at the story of Noah, we're going to look at the part of the story that very few people ever read. which is the story of Noah's survival. It's the story of what happened after the ark, right? And that's a story that raises all kinds of questions, which is probably why a lot of commentators just don't want to touch it, right? If you look through like major commentaries and you go to the Genesis 6 through 9, oh, it's the flood, right? Right. So you read all about that, and then they kind of just stop before they get to this little part about Noah that nobody knows what to do with, right? Well, we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the part that nobody knows what to do, right? Because I will argue, I contend that that story has a lot of power in it in terms of how we think about survival and ministry to one another when we've been through a hard time. I think there's a lot there. So these are some of the other things we'll talk about. These are on the sheets. Talked about, do we survive? Well, all right, so let's talk about, on your table, there is a sheet, and there's just one of them because it's, if you want a copy, I will be glad to get it to you. But Genesis 6 through 9 is generally regarded as the 4 chapters that talk about the flood, okay? In reality, I think that story is actually 2 stories of the flood coming from different periods of time that were mashed together, right? Now, if that seems odd, right, that there would be 2, then I want to just pull the curtain back a little bit to think about, okay, in Genesis 1 to 11, which is everything we know up to Abraham, right? It's the origins of the world. All of the stories are pairs, right? So like Genesis 1 is creation, Genesis 2 is creation. They're 2 different but complementary stories. The flood does the same thing. There are 2 but complementary stories. These 2 happen to be like put together. The next story is, or the third story is the story of the scattering of people on the earth after Noah, right? So you have chapter 10, which is what's called the Table of Nations. It's a big genealogy. The pair to that is chapter 11, which we'll talk about next week, which is the Tower of Babel story, right? So it's, those 2 things are paired together. So just for reference, right, and then I'll make a point about this, on your table, I pulled Genesis 6 to 9 apart for you, right? So you can see the 2 stories, right? And one of them is relatively short, and it reads just like Genesis 2, and it reads just like the Tower of Babel. It's short, it's folksy, God is really human, and it, like, you know, God enjoys the aromas and of the meat and the sacrifices, right? And then the pair, which you'll see, is much longer. And that's basically all the instructions about how to do the ark, right? So it's very legal, right? Which is very typical of sort of the paired story. It tends to be a lot more detailed and probably composed later. The point, though, that I want to make of this, about that, is that you'll notice that in neither of these these accounts do you have the story of Noah being drunk in the tent after the flood. This story about Noah being drunk in the tent is something else, right? It's added later, and what it's doing is it's bridging us from the story of the flood to the story of the repopulation of the earth, which is what we get in Genesis 10, right? How the sons of Noah and their families then scattered and went here and there and repopulated the earth, right? That's the point of Genesis 10. And what this story about Noah surviving is a bridge between the story of the flood and this scattering, right? Acting like a bridge. So why do we need a bridge? Why don't we just launch into it, right? Well, let's take a look at what the big things that jump out in the flood. I've put them up here, right? After the flood is over, 4 things happen that are super important. One is there is a blessing of God to go be fruitful and multiply, right? It's the blessing of God to repopulate and be all over the scatter of the earth, right? We hear it in Genesis 1, right? The blessing here is restated twice, right? So the blessing hasn't gone away. The second thing is what we call the law of retributive justice, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? That law is instated here about how people are supposed to move forward. So that's important. And then these last two kind of go together. God makes a covenant with the earth, with all living creatures, that God will never again destroy the earth by water. Okay, again, that comes up twice, but it's a big deal because it's one of the first covenants that we see God making in Scripture, right? And so God makes this covenant, and of course, the sign of that is the rainbow, right? Which we all know and see and love, right? The Hebrew nuance there of the rainbow is it's a bow in the sky, like a bow and arrow, right? So the bow, the curved, right? That's the language here. And so we might think of, well, why put a bow in the sky? Well, it's actually God's reminder that God is never going to exact violence on the earth with a flood. Like God lays down God's weapon of rain. We can kind of say it that way. Right? So these are the things that we come to before we get to this ending story of Noah. So when we get to the ending story, right? We have a story about, and you can I've written it out on the handouts. It's a story of Noah who is found naked in a tent, and he has planted a vineyard and has become drunk on the wine. My first reaction to that is, well, if I'd been locked up in an ark and watched all of humanity essentially die in the process, and if I were the only one with my family alive after all that time, I think I would need a drink too. I mean, seriously, right? I mean, Noah is this, I think the whole story starts off with Noah being the most righteous person on the earth. Okay, and he's chosen. But all of us have also lived long enough to know that no one is that good all the time. All of us have frailty, right? All of us have very human needs that when those needs are not met, we find ways to cope. And sometimes those coping ways aren't exactly stuff you want on a poster, right? But yet, that's our humanity, right? And so what happens is Noah has 3 sons, and one of them, Ham, sees the scripture's language is he sees his father's nakedness, and then he goes out and tells his brothers about it. Well, okay, so this is where we run it. This is where it gets interesting. The term to see someone's nakedness in the Old Testament, particularly in legal texts, is a euphemism, not always, but often, a euphemism for having sex with someone or having some kind of sexual encounter, right? So this gets really grisly if that's the case, right? But it doesn't have to mean that, right? It could also mean that he just went in and saw his father in a state of, you know, I guess, it's a kind of a state of disgrace to be seen. And it's the fact that it's not that he did anything to his father, but he goes out and tells his brothers about it, which would be an act of shaming his father. So either way you go with this, you've got a problem with what Ham did. And so the brothers, the text says they take a cloak or robe and they walk in backwards, right? Like this, so they don't see, and then they cover his father, which would be an honoring thing to do. Right? And then you have Noah speaking, which is this curse. Now, the interesting thing about this story is that Noah curses Canaan, which is the son of Ham. He doesn't curse Ham directly, he curses Canaan. And so the question is, okay, well, why? And two things come up there. One is that it could be that the early readers would have, or hearers of the story would have associated Ham with Canaan anyway, and so the two are kind of synonymous. Or it could be seen as a generational curse, which is I think that's probably a better option. And we read about this also in the Old Testament. The sins of the father are visited on the sons with generations, and so it could be that the reason Canaan is used is to signal that this is a generational curse. But whatever it is, what we also have here is a way in which Israel's neighbors are starting to be identified, right? And just like you do in a family, right? I mean, you ever had one of those family dinners where everybody's sitting around the table and there's certain people that are just never there? And one day somebody really innocent asked, well, how come so-and-so never comes to the family tables? Oh, well, when you get older, we'll tell you. That's what I was always told. When you get older, we will tell you about this person, right? But there's always a story, right, about why that person has been black sheeped, right? There's a reason. And the interesting thing that we find in Genesis is that this story about problematic relationships between a parent and a child is linked to the othering of some of Israel's neighbors. So, for example, the Canaanites are always the bad ones, right? In the Old Testament, God is always upset with the Canaanites because the Israelites were so influenced by the Canaanites. All of the multiple deities come from Canaanite culture, right? Hebrew is actually a Canaanite language. It's just been modified. So Canaanites are everywhere. They're just all over everywhere. And so it could be that that's why what this story is doing at that level. But think about the story of Lot. All right. And the big joke in the Old Testament is when you talk about Lot, there's a lot to talk about, right? Because there is nothing that isn't problematic, right, about Lot. So the story of Lot goes back to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? We all know the story. Lot had, a family, and the angels came and were trying to get him out, and before God was going to destroy the city, right? So you've got destruction, kind of parallels of flood here. And then Lot goes out, his wife looks back, she turns into, the famous pillar of salt, which when we do Sodom and Gomorrah, we'll talk about that. But then, so Lot makes it out, kind of reluctantly with his two daughters, right? And then that's kind of where we stop reading the story. Just like when we sort of stop
Yeah,
it.
what comes next is a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, when we go to the really uncomfortable, right? You know, Lot sleeps with his two daughters, get them drunk again,
Yeah.
sleeps with two daughters, and then they become, you know, the progeny of those two become the Edomites and the Ammonites. Again, big problems for Israel, right? So these stories are parallel, right? Same thing happens in Judges, right? So part of what's happening in this story, the reason why one of the ways it's functioning is to signal something about Israel's neighbors. Now, given all of that, go back to a minute. I want us to kind of know that that's there, but I think the story is doing something else in addition to that. And that is the point of that if we put if we can take for a minute, put ourselves into Noah's shoes, right? And think about what he might have been experiencing as a human being, right? How awful that must have been, even though he survived, right? Because did Noah, and this is the other thing about reading the Bible, that's we know a whole lot more than the characters in the story do, right? We know what happens. But if we put ourselves into their shoes, did Noah have any idea what was going to happen? Did he know what now, right? Now that we made it through the flood, now what happens? And it's kind of overwhelming to think about. I mean, if you've been locked up for 40 days and 40 nights with your family, I mean, no matter how wonderful they are, right? When you're locked up with anybody for 40 days, 40 nights, right? You kind of need a break after a while, but now there's no break. That's it, right? So what's he doing, right? We don't have any idea. Now, this whole thing about we don't know what's going to happen next to us. I'm going to just sit on that one thing for a second, because this is where I think some of the Holocaust material is really helpful, because there is a question. Now, I'm not drawing a one-to-one parallel. I'm just talking about sitting on the thing of when you have no idea what's going to happen next, right? I'm going to put this up here. There's a fragment that doesn't belong to anything other than just being a fragment of a train schedule that was part of a Dutch train transporting Dutch Jews to their deaths at Sobibor, which is all the way across Europe on the border of Ukraine, right? And at the Sobibor camp, these fragments are on display. And one of the things that it talks about in this one little fragment here, was of the writing of one of the officers, the handwriting of one of the officers, which was translated, a train from the Netherlands, they know nothing, Pullmans, that's the fancy train cars, comfort, they will be dead within 1 hour. And that's his name, right? So this picture of people who think everything is going to be okay, and then all of a sudden it's over, right? And I think one of the things that happens, particularly in the story of Noah, and a really powerful part of this story, is that we actually get to see Noah's humanity. And part of the value of telling a story, or anyone telling their story, and particularly the parts that are uncomfortable to tell, and particularly the parts that are really vulnerable, is the fact that when a person comes to that point where they can tell the story, their humanity shows. We have an opportunity for empathy. We have an opportunity to build compassion. We have an opportunity to embrace them. We have an opportunity to say, as your fellow human being, I understand, I am here. The opportunity, see what I'm saying, for the embrace, right? You're not alone, right? And particularly when in reading the Bible, it's very easy to think of people, think of both men and women in the Bible as heroes, as if they have no struggles at all, right? We think of, like, in Noah is a big one. Noah was the righteous one. He is the one that survived. He survived because he was righteous. He survived because of, all of these, and the rainbow, and it's all over everywhere. It makes the kids' books. It makes, the VBSs all the time. It makes big, huge stage productions about the value of, and Noah is just elevated to this person who is larger than life, more righteous than life. And that's not really, he is, but he's also human. See what I'm saying? Right. And so this story is doing something really, really important. It's humanizing Noah. And I think in humanizing Noah, it gives us a lot of grace to be human, because we are irrevocably human, and we all have our fears and our coping mechanisms, and so that's a big part of what the story does in the context of the story. The same thing happens with the story of Lot, right? And the New Testament Second Peter makes a statement about Lot that's always really curious. Characterizes Lot as this really righteous person. Okay, if you read the story of Lot, that's a little troubling, but it's a lot troubling. But again, the point of the story is in Genesis really is to humanize, Lot, right? And so we've got the humanity of Noah. I think that's really important. We gained some sense of problematic neighbors. But the second one is, through reading the story of Noah, and particularly this part, we do what's called bearing witness to the suffering, right? Which is I think it's a Christian idea, but it's also a deeply Jewish idea about respecting the suffering of someone, right? Now, bearing witness to someone's suffering does not mean that we fix it. It doesn't mean that we have the answer. And it doesn't mean that we know what to do. It means that we sit with people and we recognize and honor the suffering, even if it's just in silence, right? And so the story is here for us to bear witness to what Noah and sit with Noah and realize that, there by the grace of God go I. I mean, we all have moments like this, right? And so again, bearing witness is important. The last thing that I want us to talk about, and then I'll go into some of our questions, is that the story of Noah and the way it ends paves the way to build a new identity, right? Because as the story then begins to be told from Genesis 10 onwards, it's at this actual moment that we start getting a sense of what does God want from creation, and what does God want from God's people, right? So the way Israel does that is that they tell their history through stories, right? And the more we hook into the issue of how is the story shaping the people of God, how is the story shaping who people think, or how we see God, how we see each other, how we see the human divine relationship, how is the story serving that purpose? We'll get a whole lot more out of it than reading it strictly as this happened, then that happened, and this happened, then that happened, right? We do history that way, right? Not all of us, but a lot of us do history through facts and dates. The ancients, and particularly the Israelite world, did not do history that way. They did it through stories, which were told orally, right? And then at some point were written down, and then were some point compiled, right? But they all still had this function of building identity through storytelling. So here is my point for us for today. How do we make room for the people that we know and love? And I talk about people in our circle of influence, right? How do we make room for people to tell their stories? How do we make room? And I'm not suggesting there is an answer, right? It's an open question, right? How do we make room for people to tell their stories? And most particularly, how do we make room for people to tell the whole story? How do we make room for people to be vulnerable? Okay. When I was at the International Association of Genocide Scholars 3 weeks ago, storytelling was a huge topic on the agenda, because this is how people who have been dehumanized rehumanize, right? It's by having opportunity to tell the story. And the thing is, and I think all of us know this already, is that it takes a long time for somebody to feel safe enough to tell the story, right? There is a statistic about how long it takes for men and women to tell their stories of being sexually abused. If you're interested in this statistic, I will forward you the article. Just email me and I'll forward it to you. But some of it's relatively new research says that for a woman to be able to tell the story, it takes tell the whole story, between 10 and 20 years. For a man, it takes between 20 and 30. To where if someone has had an experience like that, it's going to be a while, right, before they're actually able to get to it and be able to vocalize and talk about it, right? And what I'm talking about is something different than a police report, right? You can go and say, this happened to me. But to actually get to the gut of it, to the feeling of it, and being able to really talk about it, it can take years. Right? So how do we make room for this? Right? How do we make room for this? I think and again, before I throw it open for discussion, one of the things the Bible is doing is making stories visible. Right? This is one of the big gifts the Old Testament gives to us. Does the same thing with Hagar. Right? Hagar has a rough story, right? And we get to hear about it, right? The Bible could have just skipped over all this, right? And if you want to see a good example of skipping over things, compare the history of First and Second Chronicles to First and Second Samuel and Kings. Same history, but Chronicles is really cleaned up. They leave out all the stuff that David did that wasn't so great. You won't find it in Chronicles. Samuel gives you all the details, but right. So, discussion. How do we make room? Yeah, Scott.
I think you have to pattern an example. Not that I'm volunteering right now. No, I mean, seriously, I think it's a matter of seeing other people being that vulnerable. So if I want people to be open with me,
Mhm.
I'm gonna have to do what?
Be vulnerable.
Yeah. It's a big ask.
Mhm. It is. It is. Yeah, Julie.
I think sometimes you have to show a lot of, you have to show interest in people. I think we're sometimes not that good at that. I mean, there's a lot of the conversations and then to try to find a way to talk about ourselves and not even really engage. I mean, I think we have to be interested and we have to really pursue that interest.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, Al.
I think it'd be a lot easier if we could live 950 years. So I'm kind of curious about that.
A long time to live with. Well, my comment on that is, I have lots of comments on that, on 150 years.
Yeah, please.
But one thing to keep in mind, and this is another one of those little glitches where actually reading the text helps. I'm not saying that we don't, right? But it helps. Is if I were to ask you, and don't think about it too much, if I were to ask you, what do most people would say the reason for God making Adam and Eve leave the garden? What would you think most people would say?
Sin.
Sin, right. Sin never actually appears in any of the garden stories. The first time the word sin is used is in the story of Cain and Abel, but it's never used in the garden story. The reason, Genesis 3:22 to 23, that they were asked to leave the garden is so they wouldn't eat for the tree of life and live forever. Remember, there's that other tree? Nobody ever talks about the other tree, right? There were two trees in the garden, and one was the tree of life. And the prohibition from re-entering, so they wouldn't eat from that tree and live for that long. So maybe it's not quite so good for us to live so long. It's something to think about, right? And, again, Israelite, Mesopotamian, Canaanite, Sumerian, all of those cultures in there, when they told their origin stories, their way of talking about greatness was, we would say, using inflated numbers, right? When you talk about 950 years, or they went into battle and killed 80,000 people, right? That kind of pile up of numbers was their way of showing greatness. It was not really meant as to go and be able to count the names of the victims. We do that, right? But their storytelling had a different purpose. I mean, how long Noah actually lived? I mean, if you want to go by, if you want to do the math, you can, but that's probably not what that story is telling us. He lived a long time. Is probably what we need to get out of that. That's just me. I'm not binding that on anybody else, right? But this is. Okay, I think we're out of time. Yeah, Aaron, you had one thing and then we'll stop.
I'm just reading into the story. He talks about, she spent 40 days and 40 nights on the boat. He actually spends over a year on that boat before he opens it up.
Mhm.
So definitely want to drink, and they also have to wait for the wine to ferment, so. Well, that time,
Yeah.
maybe it took him that long to process what happened, it's like, you know what, I still need to drink. They hear on that boat with all these people, all these animals, and it can't have smelled well.
No, that's right. That's right. Okay, John.